The space station orbiting the planet Tethria was alive with activity. Ships of every size and shape docked and departed, their bright lights reflecting off the shimmering surface of the planet below. This was a meeting place for races from across the galaxy, a hub where politics, trade, and diplomacy intersected in a constant buzz of conversation and negotiation. The United Galaxies Council had chosen this station for its neutrality, allowing representatives from different species to come together and hash out peace deals, trade agreements, or the occasional ceasefire. Elliot Kane adjusted his uniform, the deep blue fabric feeling a little too tight around his shoulders. As a young diplomat for the Terran Federation, he had been stationed here to work on some critical negotiations between multiple alien races. He was aware of the importance of his role, but that didn't stop the flutter of nervousness in his chest as he stepped off the transport shuttle. His mission was to ease tensions between the Tarknasi and the Valar, two factions whose differences had kept the peace process in limbo for years. Elliot had always prided himself on being good with words, able to understand people's emotions and motivations, but this was different. The stakes were high, and the responsibility weighed heavily on him. As he walked through the main corridor of the station, the sheer diversity of the creatures around him was overwhelming. Tall, slim Silkra from the planet Gillian stood beside squat Durax from Malrath, their unusual forms blending into the flow of traffic like a tapestry of various colors and shapes. Humanoid species, insectoids, and reptilian beings all walked together, their conversations a symphony of different languages, some of which Elliot struggled to understand, despite his years of training. The environment was breathtaking, with huge windows offering sweeping views of the planet below, its oceans shimmering beneath the station's lights. But Elliot wasn't focused on the view. His thoughts were consumed by the meetings ahead, the delicate diplomacy he would need to navigate. He didn't have much time to get acclimated, and as the hours passed, he found himself a little anxious. His communication skills had been tested in the past, but this was something else entirely. That's when he saw her. She entered the lobby of the station with an air of grace that was immediately noticeable. Elliot had been so focused on the bustle of his surroundings that he hadn't expected to be struck by anyone in particular. But the moment his gaze met hers, it was as though the entire room went silent. The woman was tall, taller than him, which wasn't something he was used to. Her skin had a gleaming silver hue, reflecting the light in a way that made her appear almost otherworldly. Her eyes, a deep shade of violet, seemed to shimmer with intelligence, and when they met his, Elliot felt a strange jolt in his chest. It wasn't just the beauty of her appearance that took him by surprise. There was something in the way she carried herself, an aura of confidence and mystery. She moved as though she was aware of her power, yet there was no arrogance in her steps. She was just otherworldly. Zalara. Her name was spoken softly by a nearby officer, and Elliot caught it just as she turned her head in his direction. Her gaze lingered on him for just a moment too long. She didn't smile, didn't make any indication that she was even aware of him beyond the brief eye contact. But Elliot was sure of one thing. She knew exactly what had just happened. There was no mistaking the way her eyes held his. She had sensed something. Elliot turned away, his heart pounding faster than it should have been. He had to get himself together. He wasn't here to chase distractions. He was here to work. But something inside him couldn't shake the image of her. He found himself stealing glances as he continued to walk, hoping she wouldn't notice. But every time he looked her way, she seemed to be watching him with the same piercing intensity. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Elliot attended several meetings, exchanged pleasantries with high-ranking officials, and even managed to present a few proposals. But the whole time he found his mind drifting back to Zalara.
Who was she? What was her role here on the station?
Why did she have such an effect on him? Later that evening, as the negotiations began in earnest, Elliot was invited to join a dinner gathering with representatives from the various species. It was an informal affair, designed to foster better relations between the factions, and a perfect opportunity for networking. The dinner was held in one of the larger halls on the station, its walls made of transparent glass that gave a stunning view of the stars outside. The space was filled with laughter and chatter, the clinking of silverware against delicate glassware, and the scent of strange, spicy foods wafting through the air. Elliot, however, barely noticed the festivities around him. His eyes were scanning the room, looking for one person in particular. And there she was. Zalara. She stood at the far end of the room, speaking with an ambassador from the Safari, a race known for their diplomatic prowess. Zalara's presence commanded attention, without her even trying. It was the way she stood, the way her silvery hair fell loosely down her back, and how her violet eyes never seemed to leave her conversation partner. But Elliot wasn't looking at the ambassador. He was looking at her, and for a fleeting moment when their eyes met across the room, it was as though time slowed down. Zalara's gaze didn't waver, and this time she gave him the smallest of nods. It wasn't a greeting, but it was an acknowledgement, and that alone made Elliot's heart skip a beat. He didn't understand it. There was something about her, some invisible pull that drew him in. He had been attracted to many people in his life, but this felt different. This was something deeper, and from that moment on, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him, even when he wasn't looking. As the evening drew to a close, he finally gathered the courage to approach her. "Ambassador Zalara?" Elliot said, his voice almost too soft to hear over the noise of the room. She turned to face him, and for the first time, she smiled. A small, knowing smile that seemed to hint at something more.
"Yes?"
Her voice was calm and smooth, yet there was a sharpness to it, as though she could see right through him. I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Elliot Kane, Terran Federation. I wanted to keep... I'm part of the peace negotiations, he said, offering his hand. It's an honor to meet you. Zalara looked at his outstretched hand for a moment before gently taking it in hers. Her grip was firm but not aggressive, and her touch sent a strange warmth up his arm.
"The honor is mine, Elliot Kane," she replied.
"It's rare to meet someone so invested in the peace process. I look forward to working with you." And just like that, the distance between them seemed to close.
There was no immediate explosion of chemistry, no overwhelming feeling of fate, but there was something subtle and undeniable in the way they stood there, exchanging words that felt personal. The noise of the party faded into the background as they spoke, their conversation natural, though Elliot found himself more distracted than usual. Zalara's presence had a way of making everything feel sharper, clearer, more intense. She listened intently as he spoke, her violet eyes never leaving his. At that moment, Elliot realized that he wasn't the only one who had felt that connection. She had sensed it too. They parted ways later that evening, but as Elliot walked back to his quarters, he knew one thing for sure. He had just met someone who would change everything. The next few days on the station were filled with meetings, both official and informal. Elliot tried to focus on his work, reminding himself that he was here for a purpose, to help mediate the peace talks between the Tarknasi and Valar. But as the days passed, his thoughts kept drifting back to Zalara. Every time they crossed paths, whether in the corridors or in the large conference halls, there was an undeniable tension between them, a silent recognition of something that neither of them had yet fully acknowledged. Zalara seemed to be everywhere. Her presence was hard to miss. Whether she was standing among groups of ambassadors having quiet conversations or simply observing from a distance, there was something magnetic about her. Elliot couldn't explain it, but he found himself seeking her out. He would catch glimpses of her when he wasn't even trying, their eyes meeting in passing, and it was as if the rest of the world didn't matter for just a moment. Despite the constant whirlwind of negotiations and intergalactic discussions, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about her. It wasn't just the way she looked, though, that certainly caught his attention. It was the way she carried herself, the air of quiet authority that seemed to surround her. She wasn't loud, but she didn't need to be. People respected her, and they followed her lead without question. And when she spoke, her words were measured, thoughtful, and precise. Every sentence she uttered seemed to hold weight. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting between the Tarknasi and Valar representatives, Elliot found himself at a small gathering in the station's lounge. It was meant to be a casual debriefing, a way to unwind after a long day of discussing treaties and trade routes. But Elliot's mind wasn't on the negotiations. It was on Zalara. He was standing by the large windows, gazing out at the stars, when a voice interrupted his thoughts.
Elliot,
The voice said, smooth and familiar. He turned to find Zalara standing beside him, her silvery hair catching the light. Her presence seemed to fill the space around them, as though the air itself was somehow richer in her company.
Zela!
Elliot replied, his voice a little too eager, but he couldn't help it. The moment he saw her, everything else seemed to fade into the background.
I didn't expect to see you here. She smiled slightly, her violet eyes studying him. I could say the same about you.
I thought you might be busy with the meeting.
I was,
he admitted, feeling a little self-conscious.
but I needed a moment.
There's a lot going on, and I'm trying to make sense of it all. Zalara nodded, her expression thoughtful.
Diplomacy is never easy, she said. You're dealing with tensions that have been building for years.
The Tartnasi and the Valar are as different as night and day. It's no wonder the talks are going slowly. Elliot exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the situation. It's frustrating, he admitted.
I've seen negotiations break down before, but this feels different. The stakes are so much higher.
If we don't get this right, it could lead to war. I can't let that happen.
Zalara watched him closely, her gaze intense. You care about this more than you're letting on, she observed, her voice soft. You don't just want to be a mediator. You want peace. You want to see this succeed.
Elliot was taken aback by her insight. I guess I do, he said, trying to explain. I've always believed in the power of words, in the idea that we can work through our differences. But sometimes it feels like we're just pushing against walls that won't ever move.
Zalara's expression softened, and she took a step closer. The walls are there for a reason, Elliot. They exist because of years of distrust, fear, and past betrayals. But that doesn't mean they're impossible to break down. He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. I hope you're right. For a moment, they stood in silence, gazing out at the stars. The soft hum of the station's machinery was the only sound that filled the space between them. Elliot couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. There was something in the way she carried herself, something that told him she understood more than anyone else on this station about the fragility of peace. I never expected the negotiations to be easy, Elliot said after a while, breaking the silence.
But I didn't think they would be this personal.
It feels like everyone has an agenda, and I'm just caught in the middle. I want to do the right thing, but it's hard when no one is willing to compromise.
Zalara nodded again, her expression contemplative. Compromise is difficult, she said, her voice low.
Especially when it means giving up something that has been a part of your identity for so long. But it's the only way forward. Without compromise, there is only conflict. And that, Elliot, is the one thing that cannot happen here. Elliot turned to face her. His curiosity piqued. You seem so sure of that.
What makes you so confident?
Zalara's gaze met his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something unspoken in her eyes. I've seen war, Elliot. I've lived through it. I've seen what it does to worlds, to people. The devastation, the pain. It's something no one should ever have to experience. Elliot's heart tightened at the rawness in her voice. He had always known that the stakes were high, but hearing it from someone who had experienced the horrors of war firsthand made it all the more real. I'm sorry, he said, his voice sincere. I didn't know. Zalara's expression softened.
It's not something I speak of often, she said quietly, but it's why I'm here.
Why I'm willing to help. I don't want to see the same destruction happen again. Not to anyone. Elliot felt the weight of her words, and for the first time, he saw her not just as an alien ambassador, but as a person. a person who had lived through unimaginable things, someone who understood the true cost of peace. It made his feelings for her grow even stronger, if that was possible. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, "for being here. For helping." Zalara nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It's my duty," she said simply. "But I am glad to help, Elliot."
"I believe in what you're doing."
Elliot felt a spark of hope rise within him. If Zalara believed in the process, then maybe there was still a chance. Maybe peace wasn't as impossible as it seemed. As the evening wore on, the two of them spoke for hours, sharing stories of their respective cultures and discussing their hopes for the future. By the time the night ended, Elliot felt an odd sense of peace, a small glimmer of optimism that had been missing before. He wasn't alone in this fight. He had Zalara by his side, and though their worlds were different, their goals were the same. They both wanted peace. They both wanted to avoid the darkness of war. As they parted ways that night, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. There was a shift, subtle but undeniable, in the way he saw her and in the way she saw him. The connection between them was growing stronger, though neither of them dared to name it. They still had their missions to focus on, but Elliot knew that whatever happened, he would never forget this night. It had been the start of something he couldn't yet understand, but something that felt incredibly important. The days after the dinner were a blur of activity for Elliot Kane. The peace talks between the Tarknasi and Valar continued to drag on, with each side holding fast to their positions, unwilling to make meaningful compromises. Elliot was beginning to feel the pressure mounting on him. As much as he tried to stay focused on the task at hand, his mind kept drifting back to Zalara. She was everywhere, her presence so powerful, it felt as though it surrounded him. Whether she was leading discussions or quietly observing from the sidelines, there was something magnetic about her. Her silvery appearance, so different from any human he'd ever encountered, somehow felt natural in a way that defied logic. But it wasn't just her looks that captivated him. It was the way she moved, the way she spoke, and the way she saw the world. There was an intensity in her gaze that made Elliot feel like she was constantly reading him, always 2 steps ahead, as though she knew everything about him, without him saying a word. That was both unsettling and incredibly alluring. As the hours stretched into days, Elliot found himself waiting for the next moment when their paths would cross. He knew he couldn't afford to get distracted. The future of the galaxy depended on these talks succeeding. Yet every time he saw her, whether in the corridors of the station or during the tense meetings, a sense of warmth and urgency filled him. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to speak with her, without the weight of diplomacy hanging over them. What would it be like to just be with her? That opportunity came sooner than he expected. One afternoon, after another long and fruitless negotiation, Elliot retreated to the quiet of the station's observation deck. It was a place he often visited when he needed to clear his mind, surrounded by windows that offered an unobstructed view of the stars. The endless expanse of the galaxy stretched out before him, and for a moment he felt small, insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe. He didn't notice Zalara until she spoke. "You look deep in thought," her voice came, soft and unexpected. Startled, Elliot turned to find her standing nearby, her eyes studying him. As always, her presence was commanding, but there was no pressure. She was just there, and it was enough.
"I was just thinking," Elliot replied, trying to gather his thoughts, but her proximity made it hard to focus. "These talks—"
"They're harder than I expected." Zalara nodded, her silver hair catching the light.
It's always harder when you're trying to change the course of history. Change doesn't happen easily.
Elliot shifted, his heart beating a little faster. "I know that, but it feels like the walls are just too high. Every time I think we're making progress, we hit a new obstacle."
"I want to help, but—" he trailed off, the frustration evident in his voice. Zalara stepped closer, her gaze softening as she listened.
You care about this more than you're letting on, she said quietly. I've seen it in your eyes. You're not just here because it's your job. You want peace.
You want to make a difference. Elliot sighed, looking down at his hands.
I do want peace, more than anything. But sometimes, I wonder if it's even possible. For a moment, there was silence between them. The sound of the station's hum filled the space, but it felt distant, as if it were no longer relevant in this moment. Zalara's voice broke the stillness, her words calm but firm. Peace is always possible, she said, a glimmer of something ancient in her tone. But it's not something you find easily. You have to be willing to fight for it. Not with weapons, but with understanding. And that takes patience and trust.
Elliot looked at her, surprised by the depth of her words.
Patience, trust. Those things don't exactly come easy in a galaxy as divided as this one. Zalara met his gaze, and for a brief moment, Elliot saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes.
I know, but sometimes the hardest things are the ones worth fighting for.
And if you don't believe in the possibility of peace, then what's the point of continuing the fight? Elliot's heart ached. She spoke with such conviction, as if she had seen the worst of what the galaxy could offer and still chose to believe that peace was worth the struggle. It made him admire her even more. I don't know if I can do this alone, he admitted, his voice quieter than before. It's hard when everyone seems to be fighting their own battles. Zalara studied him for a long moment, and then, in a movement that felt almost deliberate, she reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. You're not alone, Elliot. We all have our part to play, and you have to trust that others will join you when the time is right. Her touch sent a warm current through him, and for a moment, the weight of the station, the galaxy, and the conflict that seemed to press in from every direction faded into the background. All that mattered was the woman standing beside him, someone who understood him in a way that no one else did. The moment was brief, but it left an imprint on him. As she pulled her hand away, he found himself at a loss for words. She had this effect on him, and it was becoming harder to ignore. I don't want to drag you into this, Elliot said after a while, trying to regain his composure. The peace talks are difficult enough without involving emotions that could complicate things. Zalara shook her head, a slight smile curving the edges of her lips. You underestimate me, Elliot. I've dealt with much more complicated situations than this. And I think... She paused, as though considering her next words carefully. I think we're more alike than you realize. Elliot didn't have the chance to respond before she turned to leave, her movements fluid and graceful. He watched her go, his heart still racing from the intensity of their brief exchange. He knew he couldn't let himself get distracted. But every time he saw her, it became harder to deny the connection he felt. The pull that was growing stronger with each passing day. The next day, after another round of talks, Elliot found himself once again alone in the observation deck. This time, however, he wasn't alone for long. Zalara appeared once more, her presence as commanding as before.
I've been thinking about what you said, she began,
her voice measured but warm. About trust and patience. I believe in those things too, Elliot. And I think you're more capable than you give yourself credit for. Elliot smiled slightly, though it was tinged with sadness. I wish I could be as confident as you are. Zalara stepped closer, her violet eyes locking onto his. Confidence doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from accepting that you don't, and trusting that you'll figure it out, even when it seems impossible. Her words felt like a balm to his weary soul. For a moment, Elliot simply stood there, taking in the truth of what she said. Trust, patience, confidence. These were things he had always struggled with. But with her, it didn't seem so hard to believe. As they stood together in the quiet of the observation deck, Elliot knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep pretending that his feelings for her were just a fleeting distraction. There was something real between them, something undeniable. And even if he didn't know where it would lead, he knew that they were bound by something stronger than just diplomacy. It was something that transcended the negotiations, the stations, and the galaxies. It was something deeper, something that made him feel more alive than he had ever felt before. Zalara turned to leave once again, but this time she paused and looked back at him, her eyes, filled with a mix of understanding and something else he couldn't quite read, met his. "We're not alone, Elliot," she said softly. "Remember that." And with that, she disappeared into the station's corridors, leaving Elliot standing alone, but somehow not quite as lonely as he had been before. The days on the space station had become a blur of endless meetings, discussions, and negotiations. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Elliot felt strangely calmer. Maybe it was the presence of Zalara, or maybe it was the deep connection he felt growing between them. Whatever it was, it kept him grounded in ways he hadn't expected. Even when the talks hit another deadlock, when all seemed lost, Elliot found himself drawing strength from her words, from the way she had quietly become a constant presence in his life. The peace talks had reached a critical point. The Tarknasi and the Valar were on the verge of breaking the entire process wide open. The tension was thick in every room, every conversation. The pressure to succeed was palpable. Yet Elliot couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet hope whenever he saw Zalara. It had been days since their last conversation on the observation deck. She had said something then that stuck with him, about trust and patience. He had been skeptical at first, but now it seemed to make more sense. She was right. Change wasn't easy. It took time, effort, and understanding. And sometimes it took something more. Something that neither side was willing to give up just yet. The next meeting, however, felt different. Elliot walked into the conference room, fully expecting another round of tension, the usual round of arguments. But there was something different in the air. The room felt quieter somehow, more still, as if everyone knew that this time they would have to make a choice to either keep fighting or finally find some common ground. He looked around the room at the representatives from both sides. The Tarknasi were a proud, warrior-like species, their tall forms and strong features only adding to the intimidating atmosphere. Across from them, the Valar, smaller but no less formidable, stood their ground, their fierce independence and mistrust of the other side clear in every word they spoke. Elliot had spent weeks trying to find a bridge between them, trying to convince them that there was a way forward. But today, there was a sense of finality in the air. Either they would find peace, or they would return to the war that had ravaged their worlds for centuries. "Elliot," said a voice, interrupting his thoughts. It was Zalara, standing at the back of the room, her eyes locked onto his. There was something about the way she looked at him that made everything else fade away. Her gaze was intense, focused, and somehow calm, as if she was holding everything together, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. He couldn't stop himself from walking toward her, even though the tension in the room was high, even though his duty was to stay with the others and continue the discussions. He found himself drawn to her calm, to her understanding. "Zalara," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the chaos of the room.
"Are you all right?"
She nodded, her expression steady.
"I'm fine, Elliot."
But this moment is crucial.
We can't afford to fail now. Elliot's heart skipped a beat.
She was right. This was it. There was no more room for hesitation. Either they moved forward together, or they fell apart. And as much as he wanted to believe that peace was still possible, he knew how hard it was to change minds, especially when deep-rooted anger and distrust were involved. "I know," he said, glancing over at the Tarknasi and Valar representatives. But what if they can't see it? What if we fail? Zalara's voice softened. You can't control their choices, Elliot, but you can offer them a chance to choose differently. That's all you can do.
You've already done more than anyone could ask. Don't forget that.
He nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. The realization hit him all at once. He had done his part. The rest was out of his hands. He could try, he could offer every ounce of diplomacy and understanding he had, but in the end, it was up to them. Peace was never a one-sided effort. As he returned to the table, he caught Zalara's gaze one more time. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held something deeper, something he couldn't quite define. Perhaps it was the trust she had in him, or the understanding that, no matter the outcome, they had shared something real. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, Elliot felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't alone in this. The hours stretched on. The talks were grueling. Every word weighed down with the significance of the moment. Yet, despite the arguments and the frustration, something started to shift. Slowly, the representatives from both sides began to listen, to consider each other's perspectives. At first it was subtle, a slight change in tone, a pause before speaking. Then, as the hours passed, those small gestures turned into real concessions. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was progress. As the day wore on, Elliot found himself speaking less and less, allowing the others to take the lead. His thoughts were elsewhere. With Zalara, her presence was constant in his mind, steadying him, giving him the courage to speak when needed. She was right. He could only offer the chance for peace, but the decision was always up to them.
By the time the sun set on the station, the talks had concluded.
The representatives hadn't reached a perfect agreement, but they had agreed on a path forward. It wasn't much, but it was something, a foundation on which they could build. Elliot exhaled deeply, relief washing over him like a wave. He stepped outside the conference room, his heart still racing. He needed a moment, needed to clear his head. As he walked through the halls of the station, the familiar hum of machinery and the quiet chatter of passing diplomats felt oddly soothing. The weight of the negotiations had lifted, if only for a moment. He paused near a large window that overlooked the planet below, its deep blue ocean sparkling under the light of distant stars, and then he heard her voice. "You did it," Zalara said, stepping up beside him. Elliot turned to face her, a tired smile on his face. "We did it," he corrected her.
We all did. But there's still a long way to go.
Zalara nodded, her gaze moving out toward the stars. "There always is, but today you made a difference. That's all anyone can ask for." He felt a warmth spread through him at her words. For the first time in weeks, Elliot allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that was enough. For now.
"I couldn't have done it without you," Elliot said, his voice sincere.
Zalara's lips curved into a faint smile. "And you wouldn't have been able to see it through without the belief that peace was possible. That's why it worked. Because you were willing to believe in it, even when it seemed impossible." Elliot looked at her, his heart racing for reasons he couldn't quite explain. They had come so far, and yet he still didn't know what to say. There was something between them, something undeniable, but neither of them had yet spoken of it aloud. The connection was there, and it was real, but there were still barriers between them. The galaxy, the politics, their roles. But for now, that didn't matter. He was here, standing beside her, and for the first time, he felt at peace. "Thank you, Zalara," he said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "I don't think I would have made it through this without you." She met his gaze, and for a moment it felt like the rest of the station and its chaos had faded away. It was just the two of them. Two people who had found each other in the midst of conflict, drawn together by something neither of them fully understood. "You're welcome," she replied. "But you're not alone, Elliot. You never were." As they stood there, side by side, looking out at the stars, Elliot knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, he wasn't facing it alone.